a direct operating subsidy of 2 billion to move to a situation where if you exclude business rates, you're getting nothing. I think that is the context in which we are having this discussion. And I would just like to put on the record as well that in the last 2 years, Transport for London has reduced its operating costs. It's the first time in its history that it has done that. And actually, if you look at the savings last year, they were slightly ahead of budget. And there's a huge amount of work going on within Transport for London to transform it, make it more efficient, bear down on costs robustly. And so I wouldn't want committee members to leave this meeting today thinking that there wasn't actually huge efforts being made.
To reassure you, we have had that argument many times, so don't worry, we are aware of the argument that's coming around about that. However, despite all that work going on, TfL are forecasting themselves that they will lose £1 billion this year. And that really is the focus of a lot of our concern. It's the fact that we are going to take that hit but still be in surplus in 3 years. I'm asking you really how confident you are that we will be in surplus within 3 years.
I think your first question, although you didn't quite let me finish the answer, Chair, was about the modelling on the Elizabeth line income. Mm-hmm. And clearly, certainly in this first phase of opening, in the central section, there will be some movement from Transport for London underground services, the buses, onto the newly opened Elizabeth line. Transport for London aren't predicting huge revenue growth at that stage. The larger revenue growth comes at the end of 2019 when the full line is open. I think we will see changing patterns in the way that people travel around London when the Elizabeth line opens. So what you might see is a growth in demand, for example, in bus services to connect to the station at Woolwich in South East London. You may see people coming in from Reading who would have previously changed at Paddington but staying on to Bond Street or Tottenham Court Road. And so I think this is quite a complex picture about the movement of people from one mode of transport to another. I am very keen, and it may come up in questions at some point today as well, that we look at the transport network as a whole and make sure that we are responding to those changing patterns of behaviour. And that may mean that it's not as necessary to run as many buses from Paddington into the West End. And I think Londoners would expect Transport for London and the Mayor of London to be running a value for money service, an efficient service. And so I think that, I am confident that the modelling that has been done on the basis of what I've seen is realistic and it has been done thoroughly. But when you put new, whilst there's a lot of modelling that can be done when you put new transport infrastructure on, it does take time as well for people to adapt their behaviours. And I think we've got to keep this constantly under review.
I think that's a fair comment. I mean, it is complex. That's why I asked you the question, really, because there's so many variables within it. And Assembly members have been on the receiving end of TfL modelling and confident assertions before and then found them to be a bit off the mark, and that's what we're trying to get to. And we can argue endlessly about the reason why TfL is in the situation it's in financially, but it won't change the situation that they are in the situation they're in. And when they get their modelling wrong, then the impact can be significant, because every time you get that wrong, there are things that you had hoped to do that you suddenly can't. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I've seen Assemblymember O'Connell. I'm sure other members would like to come in as well. Yes, in fact, they all would. I'll look at your hands again in a moment. I wasn't quick enough. Which is around the Mayor's commitments in the transport strategy for 80% of journeys to be taken by foot, by public transport, or by cycling. I think that is a perfectly worthy ambition, but it tends to be, well, it's certainly worthy in some parts of London. In other parts, it's unrealistic. And I would draw your attention particularly to my constituency, Bexley and Bromley, in case you didn't know, where there are no trams, there are no tubes, there's lots of hills, and there are lots of families with young children. And doing your business on your bike or by foot becomes increasingly challenging. Cars are very, very important in that part of South East London. And one question, or one plea I would ask, is for you to come and visit South East London and have a look at the transport system there. because trying to
He lives in South East London.
Okay, I'll be more. Well, Lewisham has a tube system, a DLR system, a mainline rail system, and lots and lots of buses. Not a tube system. Well, it will be though.
You see, this is not choreographed because that was my question.
So there are big gaps in public transport provision that make that ambition more challenging than others, unless you become overly punitive to motorists, and that would be very badly received, I might put to you. So I'll just put that point and ask you if you'll be willing to come and visit Bexley and Bromley and have a look around.
You can go by tram even, to go to Beckenham Junction.
Doubtfully.
Yes,
Second?
tram
You
does
can go by
go
tram,
through
there's at least half a dozen tram
The tram
stops.
goes to Beckenham Junction, doesn't it?
Yeah,
'Cause
it does.
Just
And that's my
inside.
second question, so get off the train. I might as well go, I think.
That doesn't really help people to get around Bexley and Bromley. Right, okay, I've seen none of,
Yeah,
as I saw Steve, and then I'll take everyone else that I see in turn. Steve.
In all seriousness, and good afternoon, welcome Heidi. We have a visitation. It is linked to that point. I mean, your part of your introduction was around, yes, 80% sustainable transport, getting people out of their cars, and also your second statement linked to it was transport for all Londoners and all parts of London. So it's sort of the same conversation that Gary's talking about. From my area, Croydon, Sutton, and Sutton is the worst supplied public transport borough going. And I was pleased to see Sutton Tram was mentioned in the Mayor's email this morning. However, these are aspirations, and as Gareth has said, these are aspirations that may well be potentially deliverable in zones 1 and 2. But how again would you, not me coming down to Croydon and Sutton, how again would you rebalance that issue? How again would you potentially deliver that aspiration in areas of Bromley and Croydon where a car, frankly, is the only mode of transport in town? How would you answer that?
Okay, so clearly London is made up of very many different communities and neighbourhoods, and the challenges of central London from a transport perspective are quite different from the challenges of outer London. And you know, there's a very high mode share, if you want to use the transport technology already in central London, and there's clearly a lot more to do in parts of outer inner London and in outer London as well. Having good public transport options that reach into outer London on the radial routes that go into the centre of London, I think is critical, and I think there's a lot more to do on that, and I think that is partly underlining the push for greater rail devolution so that we can improve the quality, the frequency, the reliability of the rail network for people that don't use TfL services to get into work in the morning. I think also, though, we need to look at bus routes and connections to town centres and between town centres in outer London. I think we need to do more of some of the basic stuff around encouraging different routes to school. That's about making the alternative of walking or using your bike a more attractive prospect than jumping in the car. And that might not just be about routes to school, it might be about when you pop down to the shops at the weekend, but looking at those bus connections as well in outer London, I think is something that certainly I've heard a lot as a Member of Parliament that people were keen to see happen. And so it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. You know, in central London, the real problem for a lot of people is that when they get to the tube station, the gates have been closed and you can't get on in the rush hour. So some of the big investment projects that we don't really speak enough about in central London, be it the upgrade to the signalling on the 4 subsurface lines, the district, the circle, metropolitan and the Hammersmith and City, that will result in a 33% capacity increase on those lines. But that's obviously not an option in outer London. So I think it's a combination of things.
I'll rudely cut across you. That people in South London do hear a lot about investment, often north of the river, often zones 1 and 2. Very significant investment. Many of those people are reliant on that bus service. That's kind of what they use. So what we've heard in the past, and I think we've all pushed this hard particularly, is what I phrase the rebalancing of the bus services. So, and you actually mentioned yourself the potential reduction in numbers of buses going from, say, Paddington into central London. So what I'll be looking for during your period of office is to continue, or actually deliver, because it's not been delivered, a rebalancing of bus services, whereby you're taking buses out of central London, where largely, I would suggest, often they're not needed, to outer London, where people are very, very reliant. And that's something that I think we'd be looking for under your service. And is this something that you recognise as a potential sort of strategy?
I think what we need to do is, to protect that bus network in outer London, there may be some changes to make it more responsive to the routes that people are actually wanting, so that buses go to the place that you want them to go to. But I do recognise the centrality of the bus network in outer London. I should have also picked up on your comment about the Sutton tram link. It is, as you will know, an objective in the Mayor's transport strategy to see that new piece of infrastructure happen. Clearly there are questions about how we fund that, and I know that there are discussions ongoing between Transport for London officials and the boroughs down in Sutton and Merton, because it really could make a big difference in that part of the city. But we're also investing in other pieces of public transport infrastructure, not in central London. So if you take, for example, the Barking Riverside extension, which will extend the Gospel Oak line out to a new station at Barking Riverside, unlocking 10,500 homes out there, a big development site. I think that could really see transformation in that part of London. I know there's also plans in the Mayor's transport strategy about the West London orbital line, and clearly the work that we've been doing in recent weeks around rail devolution to try and improve those overland rail services will also be key.
Heidi, thank you.
Okay, members, I've seen in this order, because you all came up very quickly and there's no VAR, so the order that I saw you. Assembly members Russell, Pidgeon, Copley, Cooper, Twycross and Eshlomi in that order. So,
Uncle Tonk.
and then Assembly, no, that's, sorry. Assembly member Whittle will be tail end Charlie on this. So, Assembly member Russell.
Thank you very much, Chair. I want to dig into a bit more into the stuff in your third practical session, and in particular the 2040 80% of us making our trips by walking, cycling and public transport. Now, I think at a conference last week, I think you said more people walking and cycling is our #1 priority. And so I'd just like to know how you are going to go about making that so.
Well, I think that one of the things that we need to do is invest in the infrastructure. And so we've got £169 million on average each year going in to the cycling network. We're progressing our work on cycle superhighways, quiet ways, on the mini Holland schemes, Liverpool neighbourhoods, also the central London grid. I think there's a perception out there that if you improve things for cyclists, it somehow has a negative impact upon other people. And I think the exact opposite is the case. If you make streets and roads better for people cycling, you will also improve the environment for people walking when those bits of infrastructure are well designed. And one of the things that we are trying to do now, quite differently from under the previous administration, is when you are making those sorts of changes to the road network to facilitate greater numbers of people cycling and walking, you're also taking into account the bus services from the get-go. This isn't some issue that's being sort of tagged on later, that you need to look at it holistically in the planning before you get into the delivery stage. So I think that is absolutely critical. And then I think some of the work that I've already mentioned around looking at safer routes to school, improving the public realm around public transport hubs, because if people are using public transport, you will be doing more walking than you would be if you were just jumping into your car. And so creating attractive environments and streets where people want to spend time. I know a lot of boroughs have already introduced 20 mile per hour zones. I think one of the things that the Mayor is keen to look at, and I would support him in this, is how you tame some of those red routes in inner London as well. And so I think that, you know, there are key things you can do to promote walking and cycling. I think people do need to see infrastructure change, because then that acts as a stimulus in some ways to change in behaviour. And so that's why I think it's so critical that we crack on with those with that work. I'd like to see not just CS6 finished work in this term, but also progress made on CS4, CS9, CS10, CS11, where we're unfortunately facing a judicial review challenge from Westminster about the work that we would be doing up in Swiss Cottage to remove the gyratory up there. But there's a whole range of different things that we're working on at the moment, which I think will contribute to seeing more people wanting to walk and cycle more often.
You touched briefly there on the relationship between Transport for London and the Mayor with the boroughs, and this is obviously, you know, a critical thing in terms of being able to deliver on the Mayor's aspiration, the Mayor's strategy. Do you think that there need to be changes in the way that you're working with the boroughs in order to make sure that you can deliver what you need to deliver?
So I think that there is a solid relationship there. As with any of these things, there's always room for improvement. I was a councillor myself for 6 years in South East London. I sat on the Transport and Environment Committee for 4 years of that, and so I know how critical boroughs are as a delivery partner for Transport for London, and how key they will be in realising the objectives of the Mayor's transport strategy. I met last week with between 10 and 15 of the transport leads from the boroughs to talk about their priorities going forward. We had a wide-ranging discussion around things as diverse as the Silvertown Tunnel through to the infrastructure for electrical charging points. And you know, what I want to do is to have an honest and open relationship with them. I've met with Julian Bell, who is the chair of Tech, and I'm hopeful that we can have a collaborative and productive relationship going forward. I mean, they're absolutely critical. They're responsible for 95% of London's roads, and so that relationship is key, and it's something that I want to invest time and attention to.
That's certainly helpful. What about though where that breaks down, you get, you know, a judicial review situation? Have you got any sort of way through in terms of those relationships there where it seems like things are breaking down and you are effectively being blocked from delivering things that could make a real difference to people's lives? I
think that there needs to be maturity in the relationships between between Transport for London, the Mayor's office and the boroughs. Clearly on an issue such as Oxford Street or CS11, it's hugely disappointing. In the case of Oxford Street, when we had worked jointly on proposals for 2 years, invested a significant amount of money to find out that the borough wishes to pull the plug on the scheme. But I don't think we should have knee-jerk reactions to that. But equally, at the same time, I think we need to be mindful of what Londoners would want us to do with their money, in essence. And these things will arise, these problems will crop up. I think maintaining dialogue is important. But on CS11, I think it is important that we press ahead and get these improvements into the first phase of the scheme up in Swiss Cottage, because it's not just going to be cyclists that benefit up there, it'll be pedestrians too, and
bus users.
Exactly.
Something else you said at last week's conference was that we need to supercharge delivery and expand cycle superhighways, especially to outer London. So how are you going to supercharge the delivery, and will we see more than the 10 kilometres that have been delivered so far while you're in your role?
I think you're slightly misquoting me, if I may, from exactly what I said last week, because I certainly talked about supercharging the delivery of cycle routes, which will include cycle superhighways, the Quiet Ways programme. We've got some new routes proposed as well, from Tottenham Hale to Camden, from Hackney to the Isle of Dogs, and what I talked about was reaching parts of London that haven't yet been reached. I think actually, the idea of cycle superhighways that expand right out to the M25, as attractive as they may be for some people, the length of time that it would take an average person to use that whole length is that I was worried that your question was implying that was what I was suggesting.
I mean, it's about enabling people to walk and cycle for those local journeys, and
exactly.
Assembly Member Bacon was implying that in his borough that that there wasn't enough walking, cycling and public transport to enable that 80% target by 2040. So it's, how are you going to get more happening in outer London?
Well, there are the mini Holland schemes that have happened in Enfield, in Kingston, Waltham Forest. I think they're really good examples, and the Liverpool Neighbourhoods programme going forward will enable investment in particular areas. We've got the Safer Junctions work as well. In terms of speeding up the delivery of segregated space, particularly with respect to cycle superhighways, one of the things that I've been discussing with Will Norman, the Walking and Cycling Commissioner, is perhaps how you can run different parts of the process in parallel. So perhaps there could be some design work that is progressed whilst some consultation is going on. Now, what you don't want to do is lose the value and the purpose of those individual elements of the developmental process. But actually, if we're going to speed up delivery, then we need to look and see whether we're using our time most effectively. I think also, if you engage early with the boroughs, and you are engaging across Transport for London so that you're not encountering problems, with buses, etc. later on in the process, that if you invest time early and upfront, I'm hopeful, and you get agreement with the boroughs that you're working with, I'm hopeful that could see some increase in the speed of delivery. The other point I would make on this, though, is that a number of the bits of segregated cycle superhighway that were introduced in the last administration were, of course, on the Transport for London road network, where we have direct control over what happens. And in some respects, some of the easy pickings have already happened, and so there are complications, and that is why I think it's absolutely critical to get in there early with the boroughs.
And also with residents, not just the boroughs,
Yeah.
because if you just talk with the boroughs and the residents don't know what's happening, that's going to be a problem. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Pigeon.
Yes, a few areas I wanted to pick up. In the Mayor's transport strategy, he talks about TfL investigating proposals for the next generation of road user charging systems. I'd like to understand your views on tackling road congestion. You want, and you've said, you're really behind the move to getting more people cycling, walking, using public transport, but one of the elephants in the room is there's only a finite amount of road space, and it's how you use that in a smarter way. So what's your thought on reviewing the congestion charge now, and also looking at future road pricing?
I think the first thing to say on this is that obviously the introduction of the congestion charge back in 2003 was world leading, and it had a very significant impact upon reducing the volume of vehicles that were in the congestion charging zone, but also reducing overall congestion. I think it resulted in a 30% reduction in congestion, as well as improving air quality. I think in the longer term, though, we do need to think about a different approach, which would better account for the congestion that people are causing when using their cars. So are they travelling in peak times? What are their emissions levels? How far are they travelling? Because, of course, at the moment, you might enter the congestion charging zone for, 200 metres at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday, as opposed to doing a longer journey at 8 a.m. on a Monday morning. And that's before you even get into the type of vehicle that you might be using. I think, however, that the priority for Transport for London at the moment, given the expansion of the ultra-low emission zone out from the central area to the north and south circulars in 2021, I think the priority for Transport for London has to be about getting the technology right in terms of the operation and enforcement of the ultra-low emission zone. So I am open to the idea, and I think in the longer term we will need to review this, and it's an area that I'm interested in doing some work on. But what I wouldn't want to do is take resources away from that really important piece of work, which is about getting the expanded ULEZ right in 2021.
See it as an inevitable step if we're to tackle congestion and to meet the Mayor's target of getting to 80% of journeys.
It's something we need to be looking at.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you. In the part of that 80% target, it's a very long term. Will we be able to see interim targets for mode use, probably in the business plan we were hoping for as it comes out in the autumn, so we can hold you to those pledges?
So what I would like to explore with Transport for London officials is how we can see what the overall trajectory is with respect to increasing the numbers of people who are walking, cycling, using public transport. Clearly in the Mayor's transport strategy there are some very ambitious targets in there as well around, for example, making our roads safer, for greening the bus fleet. And so that's a discussion that I'm actively exploring with officers at the moment.
I look forward to hearing more on that. The Transport Committee did a couple of really good reports last year to do with the bus service, and we particularly were looking at bus safety and wanting bus operators to have safety incentives in their contracts rather than just a financial incentive. Is this something you'll be looking at as Deputy Chair of TfL?
Well, I know that Transport for London are developing a new safety standard for buses, and that's obviously in line with the MTS objective that no one would be killed on or by a bus by 2030. And I think they're doing a whole range of research at the moment about things such as autonomous emergency braking, redesigning the front of the bus to reduce the impact of collisions, and exploring the opportunity for potentially audible warning systems. And so, improving bus safety as well as greening the bus fleet is something that is hugely important to the Mayor. It's important to myself. I had a good meeting last week with representatives from Unite, who obviously represent a large number of bus drivers in London, also talking about doing a piece of research to look at issues around bus driver fatigue, and we've agreed with Loughborough University that they will be leading on that. So it's something that is already on my radar and on my agenda, and it's something that we do feel strongly about.
That doesn't pick up my specific question, though, about the safety incentives in the contracts with the bus companies rather than financial incentives. It's in the bus operator's interest not to have collisions with their buses. It costs them money and so on. But actually, when we spoke to drivers, it's clear there's a financial incentive that makes, the bus operators operate the fleet in the way that they do. And what I would like is safety incentives actually built into those contracts. Is that something you'll go away and have a look at? That's great, thank you very much. Could I just pick up, I know other members ought to come in, another issue that TfL historically has been felt doesn't properly engage and listen to some transport user groups. Historically, the Gospel Oak to Barking train user group has felt very aggrieved that their voice wasn't heard. Others, private hire drivers, feel they don't. Elected politicians often feel that they aren't listened to. What work do you want to do as Deputy Chair of TfL to make sure TfL really engages with elected representatives and transport user groups and individual drivers, for example, to make sure their voices are heard and help shape transport strategy going forward?
I think one of the benefits, you might say, of the job that I've done previously means that a number of elected representatives, be they members of Parliament or council leaders across London and cross-party as well, know how to contact me personally, and I'm very keen to make sure that I'm an accessible and approachable Deputy Chair for London, and that applies to the Assembly here as well. And I know I've already been on some visits with some of you sat around the table, and I think I've got others planned for the diary as well. With regard to for example, taxi and private hire, and I know that there are a number of different groups that represent the taxi trade. I've had good discussions with Helen Chapman at Transport for London, who I know has quarterly meetings where she invites lots of the different representatives in. I'm quite keen to go along to one of those. I've been able to meet the LTDA already. In fact, Steve McNamara insisted that I drive a zero emissions capable taxi down Tooley Street at 9 o'clock in the morning a couple of weeks ago. And I did think it might have been the worst start to a new job that anyone ever had when he suggested that I just pull a UE and I will find that people move out of the way. I'm keen really to, whether it's the disability groups, I think there's a huge issue around improving access still. We've got a big programme at Transport for London about improving access at stations, but I'd like to work with some of the disability groups about the Access for All funding at overland stations, which I think there were 9 stations back in 2015 which had been programmed by the government. These are mainline overland stations where the funding has been withdrawn, and I think we could be working together to really make the case to government to prioritise investment in those stations, to make them accessible for people, not just with disabilities, but mums with buggies, people who are travelling with large suitcases. And so, I'm keen to nurture good relationships, close relationships with a wide range of different stakeholders.
You review generally TfL's engagement to make sure it really is reaching all the groups and people it needs to?
Yeah, I think one of the changes that Transport for London have made in recent years as well is they've established a new team to ensure that there are individuals who have in-depth knowledge about the whole range of different transport issues in an area, and so that restructuring has happened quite recently. Clearly I will be keen to make sure on a local level that's hitting the spot, and that people in the boroughs are happy with the engagement and the responses that they're getting from Transport for London.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Assemblymember Copley.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to talk about the sort of financial side and just go back slightly to road pricing, which Caroline has already mentioned. Do you see it as well as something that could be very useful in reducing congestion and helping the Mayor meet his ambitious target? Do you see it as well as an opportunity for TfL to raise a significant amount of finance, especially given the Mayor actually has very few levers with which to raise money beyond the council tax precept?
I think any congestion charging scheme, is required by law to be established with the aim of relieving congestion. And so I think any future scheme that may be considered, you would need to look at the legislation that gives you powers to do that. And I'm not completely sure what the answer is at the moment, but I think that any of the schemes that we are looking at the moment, whether it's the decision to go out to consultation last week on the removal of the congestion charge exemption for the drivers of minicabs, that is about dealing with increasing congestion in the congestion charging zone. The number of minicabs back in 2003, when that exemption was set up, was about 4,000 in the zone. It has exploded to about 18,000 now. And whilst that may have consequential benefits with respect to air quality, this is about tackling congestion. And I think that Londoners would expect us to be dealing with the problems that they are facing. And I think that would be, be that congestion or poor air quality. I think that would have to be the overriding reason for considering the nature of any future road charging scheme.
Of course, although the extra revenue might be a nice thing to have as well on top of that. And you mentioned the TfL's development programme and the team with the Graham Craig runs, and I think it's been quite impressive how they've built that team up over the last few years. Do you think there's a risk, though, particularly with uncertainty around Brexit, that if there was some collapse in property prices or things like that, that could then have a knock-on effect on TfL's finances as well?
I think I want to work very closely with James Murray, the Deputy Mayor for Housing, on this, and I think there are twin objectives with regard to the land holdings that Transport for London has, and that is to make a contribution to tackling the housing crisis, and in periods of economic downturn, shall we say, often some of the schemes that come forward are those which are supported by government grant, and certainly if you look at history in London, that is the case with a number of developments that may have come forward and have been were planned to have been private homes for outright sale. In order to actually get the construction going forward, the government has had to step in. Now, I don't necessarily hold much hope that the government is going to be doing that immediately, but dependent upon how things play out over the next couple of years, I don't think anyone can predict exactly what will be happening. So I think what we need to do is have a responsible approach to TfL land. We need to be seeking to get some income from it, ideally recurring, sustainable income in, with the build to rent model that I talked about. There will be some capital receipts because it may make sense in some locations to sell a piece of land outright to a developer, but we've just got to get the balance right across the whole portfolio.
And finally, I wanted to ask about Oxford Street. I think a lot of us were extremely disappointed that after all that work had been done, Westminster decided to pull the rug out from underneath it. And obviously the Mayor does have some, it is a scheme which, it seems a shame that one borough can essentially torpedo a scheme that has benefits for all of London, given the it's a strategic destination. Do you think the Mayor should be prepared to use the powers that he has in the GLA Act to, if Westminster hold out and refuse to compromise or refuse to take a sort of different scheme forward, do you think the Mayor should be prepared to use the powers that he has to take over the street essentially and to make the scheme happen?
Nothing is off the table. That's the first thing I would say. We haven't ruled any options out. My understanding of that particular power, though, is that if the local authority objects, it would ultimately revert to a decision by the Secretary of State for Transport. I think you're right to say that this is a scheme that could have had benefits stretching far and wide, really. It's the nation's high street. You know, it's an area we're at the moment, you know, hugely busy with tourists, people from coming to shop from other parts of the country. We want to keep it that way. We want it to be, you know, the premier outdoor shopping destination in the whole of the country. But sadly, at the moment, you know, one person every year is killed on Oxford Street. 60 people are injured. When the Elizabeth line opens there'll be more people coming in from further afield, adding to congestion and the numbers of people there. It's got some of the poorest air quality, if you look at where the air quality hotspots are. And so I think there are so many reasons to transform that part of London, and it was hugely disappointing for me to, just 4 days before I started in this job, read that press release which effectively said that Westminster Council wanted to walk away from it. The Mayor of London has written now to the leader of Westminster Council and has said that you need to be able to demonstrate that any scheme would have a transformative effect, both in terms of safety, air quality, address the crowding issues, and that you need to get on with this. And given that £8 million has already been spent, you know, no more Transport for London money should be used without speaking to us first. And that if you can't come up with a scheme that is going to deliver real transformation, then we will have to consider what we do with the money that has been allocated in the business plan to fund the improvements there.
Thank you.
Member Cooper.
Sorry, I thought we were going in a different order. I wanted to ask you a bit about air quality, tube noise, you won't be surprised, and also something about Heathrow. So with regard to air quality, one of my big concerns has been the failure to have any kind of control over the number of the private hire vehicles, which we've talked about a bit already. And the figures that we've been seeing are the registrations are going up from 47,000 to 90,000 a year. Is there anything that can be done on this? Because surely this must be having a detrimental impact on air quality, because congestion is just simply not going down, as well as having impacts like, you know, fewer people on buses.
I mean, one of the things that Transport for London has been doing is lobbying government for a whole range of changes with regard to private hire and the minicab industry. And one of the things that we would like government to consider is whether there should be a cap, whether London should have the ability to set a cap on the number of private hire vehicles in London, as well as we'd like to see a change, for example, in the statutory definition, or we'd like a statutory definition full stop of what applying for hire means, and some change around the issue of cross-border licensing, so that a cab which was licensed outside of London couldn't just come and start driving around London streets, and that there should be a requirement where a journey needs to either start or end in the authority where the cab has been licensed. So there's a whole range of lobbying that is going on about that, because it would require some legislative change.
Air quality issue, I mean, obviously we've seen the government making its statement today on the road to zero, which apparently is not a road to zero, indeed, and moving not just the cab drivers, which obviously that we've been talking about doing, but also if we are going to have any private hire vehicles of any number, and at the moment the number is uncontrolled, moving them towards electric vehicles as well has to be the way forward, as well as implementing charging arrangements. I mean, you talked about ULEZ obviously, and also road pricing.
So one of the second part of the consultation that was launched last week, in addition to a proposal to remove the exemption for private hire vehicles from the congestion charge, it was also about switching from the ultra low emissions discount to a cleaner vehicles discount. And of course, if you were a minicab driver and your car was eligible for the cleaner vehicles discount, that would in effect give you a congestion charge exemption. So we're looking at ways in which we can incentivise cleaner vehicles in the private hire fleet. We are as well looking at what we can do to green the iconic black London taxi. I think there are about 250 or so zero emissions capable taxis on London's roads at the moment.
Which is a very tiny number so far.
It is a tiny number, I accept that point. One of the issues has been that there's only one place in the country at the moment that is manufacturing these vehicles up in Coventry, and so we need to scale up the production and we need to make sure that the demand is there for them, and so Transport for London have got a de-licensing scheme in place, but I think we probably need to look at how some of those incentive arrangements are operating and whether there is something differently we could be doing in order to expedite and increase the interest and take-up of new zero emissions capable black taxis as well.
So it's not just expediting and accelerating the take-up in terms of the taxis and the private hire vehicles. It's also in terms of those people that I think Assemblymember Bacon and Assemblymember O'Connell have just referred to, who live in outer London where practically a public transport desert, I think they were trying to say, with a tram edging into the corner of Bexley and Bromley and a few buses. So there are many people there who are still very reliant on their cars. Now, whilst we would, the majority, in fact, the overwhelming majority. Now, whilst it would obviously be great to see everybody do a massive step change towards public transport and walking and cycling, I still think, and the Environment Committee has just produced a report actually this year on electric vehicles, having that infrastructure to drive people away from both one, personal ownership of vehicles. So I'd like your thoughts about car clubs and also getting car clubs to move many more, if not all of their vehicles over towards electric as well. But also what more can be done to encourage people individually where they still feel the need to have, as an interim arrangement, continue reliance on a car. What more can be done to get people towards electric vehicles as well? And I wasn't very happy really with the government's stuff today. I mean, the Mayor's already said let's do it by 2030, 2040, and let's keep hybrid. Sounds a bit weak to me.
Okay, so in terms of car clubs, I'm broadly supportive actually, and I think there is more that we could do to encourage car clubs, and obviously this is quite controversial because, you know, ideally we'd like people to be doing more to walk and cycle and use public transport, but I think in terms of the convenience for some trips, for some people, car clubs can provide a real answer. Some of the
20% of the journeys that aren't going to be done on the 80% walking, cycling and public transport, car clubs seem to me to be potentially quite a good fit
I agree
for that area.
I think, you know, I've spoken already about the introduction of the ultra low emission zone, and clearly that's the reason for not introducing it immediately on the north and south circular boundary is to give people a chance, you know, if they're thinking about buying a vehicle or trading a vehicle in, is to actually, you know, procure a vehicle that will meet those thresholds. And I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done about increasing the clarity of exactly what is going to be happening when in terms of ULEZ going forward. I think that I share your assessment of the government's Road to Zero document today. I think there are some things in it that are welcome, but I think that it doesn't really address, you know, the critical question is, well, what are you doing now to address today's vehicle emissions? And I think that a targeted diesel scrappage fund for cities would help tackle emissions and help people switch more quickly. So I hope that is broadly in line with your thinking.
But do you think all of the work that we're doing on this and the steps that the Mayor has taken to sort of incrementally get Londoners to go on this journey, the T-Charge launching last year, the ULEZ in the central London area from April next year, 3.5 years' time, we're hoping to take Londoners on that larger journey towards the bigger ULEZ, and obviously there are some issues, I think, for people that live particularly near the boundary. Is that not all going to be completely undermined if Heathrow builds car parks for another 40,000 cars and we increase the number of flights over London? It's already a dreadful air quality hotspot. What can we do about that?
I think that the decision that the Mayor has taken to join a legal challenge with the 5 boroughs about the expansion of Heathrow is the right decision. You know, we do need more aviation capacity in southeast England, but the third runway at Heathrow would expose hundreds of thousands of more people to worsening air quality, to adverse noise impacts. There's no answer at all to how the government proposes to fund the infrastructure that would be required for people to get there in the first place. And, you know, it seems to be that they're suggesting there's a sort of a wing and a prayer that Heathrow, you know, would pay for most of it, if not all of it. And I think that the expansion of Heathrow makes it much more difficult for London to meet the air quality targets that it is legally obliged to meet. And so I think the Mayor took the right decision in indicating before that vote in Parliament, in fact, that if the vote was successful, that he would join the legal challenge, and, you know, the Mayor and officials from Transport for London, you know, are working on these issues now.
Well, part of my constituency is obviously very badly impacted, particularly in the Battersea and Putney part of Wandsworth, which is one of those boroughs. And you mentioned noise, which brings me on to my final point, which is about tube noise. And thank you very much for coming and experiencing the appalling levels of noise, both inside the tube trains, but also in people's houses. And with the trains going past potentially literally every minute and a half, if you've got noise on both lines, which luckily where we were, it was only actually on the northbound northern line. I understand that there is this programme for noise alleviation across London. You may not be able to answer this in full, but where, how long is that going to take, and where would you say this sits in your hierarchy of priorities, which I know, you know, there's quite a lot here obviously to be taken on.
So, you know, on the issue of tube noise in particular, I mean, clearly it is a good thing that the Mayor has finally got the night tube up and running on those 5 lines, and also on part of the London Overground network. But clearly that does create a different experience for some people who are living above the lines, when, you know, otherwise their home would have been very, very quiet. Transport for London have revolutionised the way that they deal with noise complaints in the last 2 years at the Mayor's request. Prior to 2016, there wasn't a proper process in place for receiving complaints, for collating all the complaints into a database. And as you will know from our visit to South Wimbledon yesterday, there are a number of places on the lines which are operating the night tube that we have looked at engineering solutions to try and reduce the amount of noise that is being heard in properties that are either directly above or adjacent to some of those tube lines. That has then had a knock-on impact in some places on the amount of noise experienced in the tube. And so there's a further engineering solution that is being investigated in that. I think that where complaints are made, it is right that Transport for London respond in a timely fashion, and that they take reasonable steps to try and mitigate and address that noise, because clearly if you're trying to sleep and it is significant, then, you know, it can be a huge disturbance to people. And so I'm keen that Transport for London continue their approach in this area and do what they can to mitigate this disturbance where possible.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Assemblymember Twycross.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a couple of questions around the workforce for the major infrastructure project. We haven't spoken a lot about Brexit in this chamber today, although I think there's quite a lot of talk outside.
Really?
Possibly.
Wow.
So, I don't know. Somebody just was here.
the news, I doubt.
Yes.
Oh.
So Boris
Boris
Johnson.
Johnson's
Just come up on my phone.
So anyway, going back to your role, you mentioned
Members,
bad
focus,
Brexit
please.
and what the impact might be. What would a bad Brexit mean for access to skilled workers from Europe? Because I went to see the Queen Elizabeth line quite recently, and it was quite evident that a lot of the people working there were from overseas, admittedly not just the EU, but what would that mean for making sure that our infrastructure projects stayed on track?
I think there's a huge challenge with respect to the construction workforce, not just on transport infrastructure projects, but on housing projects as well. And when we look at the figures, we know that people from Europe aren't coming to London in their same numbers, and they're also leaving London in greater numbers. And so clearly there is a big infrastructure programme that is underway in London. I know Transport for London does a lot of work to try and secure local labour, make sure that good apprentices are available, and certainly on Crossrail I think there's a strong story about apprenticeships on that line. I went and visited a couple of weeks ago and had a briefing from the team there, and they've certainly got a very, very strong story to tell about equipping the next generation with signalling skills, engineering skills, and so I think that's a really positive thing. But historically in this country, I don't think we have invested enough in skills training in the construction sector, and this will hamper our ability, I think, in future to deliver projects on time and to budget, because if there's a scarcity of labour, then clearly the costs of that labour will go up as well. I think on the other point that I would make about a bad Brexit and its impact upon the transport network, and it's something that I touched upon earlier but didn't expand upon. Whether Brexit happens or not, there are already changes happening to London's economy. If you take the example of the European Medicines Agency that is based over in Canary Wharf, even if Brexit doesn't happen, that agency will move. Now, it may be 900 jobs, and some people will say, well, that doesn't matter, but it's also 42,000 nights that people spend in hotels. That's at least 84,000 journeys on the DLR, and add to that how you actually get to the DLR in the first place. And so that's why I refer to this uncertain economic climate, and the availability of construction skills is part of it, but it's also about the wider level of economic activity and the nature of it that is happening in London at the moment.
Thank you. And you mentioned the apprentices that had gone through, I understand that it was a relatively diverse sort of group of apprentices who've gone through the apprenticeship scheme on the Elizabeth line. But even where you get relatively diverse cohorts of apprentices, it's still quite small numbers of women coming through, and young women traditionally don't go into the type of apprentices that lead to well-paid jobs. How will you make sure that we get more diverse apprenticeships and sort of see that cohort coming through and that diversity in the workforce? I
think I remember a visit that I paid with Val Shawcross actually to London Bridge Station when it was being rebuilt, and the individual who showed us round on that day was a senior female engineer, and when I went to Crossrail just 2-3 weeks ago, I was shown around the Tottenham Court Road site by a female site forewoman, if you like, and I think it's really important that we see role models for women in the transport sector, and that those individuals are visible. I think it is a male-dominated profession. Clearly, you need to be working on the pipeline, and that probably starts back at primary school, because girls, when they're growing up, need to believe that they can do any job that they want to do, and if you wait until the age of 16, 17, 18, that's probably too late. And so, I know that, the Mayor is very committed to making Transport for London more representative of the city that it serves, both along gender lines, but also in terms of ethnicity. And so I'm quite keen to support him as much as I can in moving that agenda forward.
Okay, thank you.
Assembly Member Eshalomi.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome again, Heidi. I just wanted to ask you about, you talked about the improvements that we're going to see over the next few years on buses and how valuable buses are to many Londoners. The reality is we have a fantastic underground network when it's working, when relevant lines aren't failing, and you're not feeling like you're going to die from heat because it's so hot there. But the reality is that for a lump of Londoners, the underground is still quite expensive, so they do rely on buses. So a number of some of our most poor constituents use the buses. One of the things that we've seen is that network performance on buses is measured by kilometres, and in some areas there's been a reduction in the kilometres, and we're seeing those changes being gradually announced, and the changes are being announced in terms of the schedules and the timetables in some of these bus networks. And in response to some of the points that my colleague Caroline mentioned around TfL's consultation with elected members and residents, we are getting a sense of a lack of consultation, if that, from TfL, and almost a case of we're going to do this anyway and we'll consult you afterwards, or we won't consult you at all and we'll just tell you about these changes. Can we get a sense on how you are going to work with the management team at TfL to ensure that changes like that and any other proposed changes will be properly communicated, not just with us as elected representatives, but those users who rely on those key valuable services?
It's a really good point to make, and you will know that Transport for London is legally obliged to consult on route changes, but not legally obliged to consult on changing frequencies on routes. But what the law says, as far as I'm concerned, is neither here nor there when it comes to this, because if we are going to look at changing frequencies of buses in central London, then it is absolutely essential that we have a strategic, coordinated conversation with the boroughs and with people who are using our services. I think one of the key things that we need to be concerned about, and that I'm concerned about personally, is making sure that we protect journey times in all of this, and that we get the right services in the right places. We've got a situation at the moment where in the morning peak on Kingsway, 101 buses travel the length of Kingsway, and we've all seen buses that are stacked up one after the other that are a third full. And I think Londoners would expect us to be saying, in a tight financial climate, how do we use our bus network most efficiently and most effectively. But, if we're going to be doing that, we need to have a proper conversation. We need to be clear about what we're seeking to achieve. As I said earlier, those changes in London's transport overall, be it the 10% extra capacity that will come on the rail network with the Elizabeth line. We've also made travelling on the bus more flexible with the introduction of the hopper fare, and so it's easier for people to make interchanges. But if we're going to reshape the bus service in central London and look at how we can improve some of those connections to town centres in outer London, I think we do need to have a proper and clear dialogue with people in London about it.
That's great to hear. And most of the other things I wanted to ask you have been covered apart from, you did cite and mention that you've met with a few union reps already, that you met with Unite drivers and you also met with the LDTA. So across the transport network, a number of hard-working transport staff are represented by unions, and a number of those staff members are Londoners on a low income. We can see collaboration of working with unions where we can get a better outcome for them. So, example, the good pay deal that all bus drivers were awarded recently with the Mayor and the General Secretary of Unite announcing that at Morden Station shows that collaboration with unions who are workers can also be a good thing, not just for them but for Londoners who are using that service. So I just wanted to get a sense of your approach in your role as Deputy Chair for TF, in your new role as Deputy Chair of TfL, how you see your relationship with the unions is going to be going forward.
So I think the first thing to say is that I want to have a professional relationship with the unions, and one that is built on the principles of collaboration and respect. It was good to meet with those Unite reps in recent weeks to talk about things such as the fatigue study that Transport for London are commissioning. But also one of the other things we're looking at is, whilst we've got agreement now on a starting salary of £23,000 for any bus driver in London, irrespective of the operator that you're working for, what we'd like to do in terms of creating a licence for London is that you essentially enable a bus driver, if moving between jobs, to take their sort of grade with them when they move across, so they don't have to return to the bottom of the scale. So that's a really positive thing that we're working with the unions on. I'm keen, though, not to circumvent the negotiating framework that Transport for London has in place with the unions across the whole of the network, though, because I think there are some good relationships there. My starting point, when I guess some flashpoints might arise, and I think in an organisation that is got the scale and the complexity of what TfL does, and where we're trying to modernise and transform the organisation, there will be issues that come along that are controversial. I think my starting point will always be, is this the right thing to do? Is Transport for London behaving reasonably? Have we consulted as we should do? Are we listening and responding to valid concerns when they are made? And are we treating employees fairly? And I think those are my broad principles for relationships with the unions. But as you say, they are absolutely critical, to delivering transport services in London. And so I'm really keen to make sure that we have that, good professional relationship.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Before we move on to the next member, just a clarificatory question. When Assemblymember Echelon was asking you about bus routes, and you said that correctly that TfL are required to consult on changing routes but not frequencies, and you then said with regard to frequency what the law says is neither here nor there. What did you mean by that precisely? Are you saying that you will consult on frequency?
Sorry, I should have been clear. I think we should go above and beyond what the law requires, because that is not to say that there will be an individual consultation on every individual frequency change, but if we are looking strategically about how we make the bus network more responsive to the needs of Londoners in 2018, then I think we need to have a proper dialogue about that and be clear about what is being proposed. I don't think it's good for the environment. I don't think it's good for other road users or for TfL's finances if we have London buses stacked up one after the other if they're a third empty. So I think Londoners would expect us to be saying, how do we provide the best possible bus service in the places that people want it? And I think we need to have, an open and detailed dialogue on that as a whole.
Dialogue is a word that can be interpreted in different ways by different people. How would you define dialogue?
I think it's about being clear about what it is that we're trying to achieve in this context, giving people the opportunity to comment on it, making sure that all the key stakeholders are aware of what it is that we're trying to achieve, and an opportunity to comment, make amendments. And
So a consultation.
yeah, I mean, I don't know whether Assembly Member Baker you are seeking to make me commit to some sort of legal consultation, which I don't know exactly what the stipulation would be. So I'm sure you have something in your mind.
I wouldn't
perhaps,
dream of such a shallow, low trick at this confirmation.
You're
No,
putting
I'm
words
just
into
trying
my
to.
mouth.
I'm trying to help you not mismanage expectations, because I think the general sentiment that you have expressed is something that I think everybody would endorse enthusiastically. But the trouble is, when you say that we're going to have a dialogue and going to make it as open and far-reaching as possible, and then that involves sending a press release out or ringing up a few council leaders but nobody else, people will feel that you have somehow cheated them. So I'm just trying to, and I don't want to be overly prescriptive about this, because I think you're offering something that is not on the table at the moment, and I don't want to strangle it with bureaucracy, but I do want to understand better by what you mean by dialogue.
It will be more than a press release, you can rest assured, and I will bring the proposals to you, in the coming months, and we can have that discussion then.
Okay.
Could I
Assembly Member Whittle.
On that point, Chair.
Oh, sorry.
Could I
Assembly Member
just
Pigeon.
briefly, so I think it'd be helpful, and I've pushed the Mayor and he has resisted so far, but to look at significant changes to timetable as well as whether there's a threshold. So if a route is being halved from 6 an hour to 3 an hour, that actually is significant. And looking at a consultation, or however you want to word it, a dialogue, but also letting people know way in advance, not just days before, or some of them have been after the cuts have happened. So I think that would be helpful in your thinking.
I think I can reassure you that almost those very words came out of my mouth in a discussion with Transport for London officials last week. And so I understand the point that you are making. If you are going to halve a service, such as I know happened on the RV1,
yes.
then, and there's a
Yeah.
review of that happening, which
Yeah.
I think is due to come back in September, it is quite different from if you are expecting a bus to arrive between every 7 and 8 minutes, and if that then goes to every 9 or 10 minutes, there is a slight change in the significance. Well, there's a difference in the significance of that change. And so I think we need clarity on, the number of changes that fall into that category. And I think that will provide some reassurance to people.
Thank you.
Assembly Member Whittle.
Afternoon, Heidi. So I will be very brief here. I'm sure you're aware that there's been a very alarming rise in sexual offences on transport in London. And I wonder whether you saw your role in any ways helping to combat that, or what your possible role would be in addressing that. It's quite a specific rise that we've discussed on the Police and Crime Committee.
So obviously I'm concerned about any rise in crime on the Transport for London network. Transport for London, as I understand it, have been running a campaign in recent months called Report It to Stop It, which is about actually getting the numbers of people reporting different incidents up. That is not to be making any excuses, though. I am due to be meeting with the British Transport Police shortly, and this is something that I want to make sure that we're doing all that we can to tackle any forms of crime on the Transport for London network. I think we are still a safe railway and a safe place to be using buses, and the overall the overall proportion of incidents compared to the number of people who are travelling and the number of journeys made every day is very small. But where there's any increase in any form of crime, I want to be discussing with British Transport Police, with Sophie Linden, the Deputy Mayor, for policing, to ensure that we're doing all that we can to tackle it.
So you're meeting the British Transport Police quite soon, are you?
Yes.
And you will discuss, presumably, this sexual assault as well as everything
No,
else?
I asked for a meeting after the recent crime figures were published on the network. I asked for a meeting straight away.
Okay, thank you.
Any other member? Okay, from your perspective, your deal is over. And you are more than welcome to stay, but you'll need to stay in the gallery if you wish to. Members, can I thank Ms Alexander for her attendance and her answers here today. I was about to say we're going to talk about you secretly, but we're not really, because it's going to be broadcast. Okay, members. Part C of the agenda today is to discuss whether or not we recommend to the Mayor that he proceeds with the formal appointment of Heidi Alexander as Deputy Mayor and Deputy Chair of Transport for London. Any member wish to open it? Assembly Member Copley.
I think that we should recommend to the Mayor that he does appoint Heidi Alexander. I think she answered all of our questions with great knowledge, and I think that she will be a fantastic Deputy Chair of Transport for London.
Any dissenting opinion?
No, I'd like to second that.
There is a form of word suggested, which is that it be agreed that to recommend that the Mayor should proceed with the appointment of Heidi Alexander to the office of Deputy Chair for Transport for London. If members want to add or subtract anything to that, we can agree the wording here, or we can agree to delegate to me in consultation with group leads an amended statement. But if you're content with the one that I just read out, we could just go with that. So, Member Pigeon.
Can I just add, I think it's incredibly polished performance and really informed for someone new to this to have got that depth. I think we should maybe welcome Heidi's comments about reviewing the bus issue, the bus consultation and engagement around changes to bus service, and we look forward to that coming forward in due course. I think that was really welcome to hear that, and that's some policy change from what we've heard before.
You work up. Someone wants to circulate.
Would the committee be happy to delegate to the chairman final letter, noting that the letter has to go to the Mayor by tomorrow?
Yes.
So it will be a very
it will be with group leads and with Caroline Pigeon in the normal way that we do these things as with any committee. It will be circulated by email, but as we just said, it needs to be done very speedily. So keep an eye on your emails later today, because it will be in there later today.
Okay, great.
Okay, with that, I think we are all agreed. Is that correct?
Agreed.
Thank you. Then a letter will be sent to the Mayor following the meeting to confirm the committee's recommendation. Can I thank you all for your attending and your contributions?
Thank you.
And Ms Alexander, congratulations. The Assembly is not standing in your way, and she's reading that Boris Johnson design. It's unfair of me to do that, because you're no longer on the floor. Anyway, the meeting is closed.
She won't come and visit Betsy from me now.
Yes.